Isaac Rosenberg lived a short life, 1890 to 1918, but I like to start this walk of the radical Jewish East End with Isaac Rosenberg's plaque, because those dates are very much the dates that we're going to be walking through. We're going to be looking at the history of Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe into the East End of London in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And we'll be finding out about how the Jewish immigrants that came changed the East End, and also how the East End changed them. Anyway, I'm going to take us off the main road. We're going to be in some alleyways and some streets. We'll see lots of things, see the remnants of lots of things, tell you a lot of stories, and hopefully you'll ask me lots of questions along the way. I'm standing here in Clerkenwell Green with Alex Gordon, who is the chair of the Marx Memorial Library, which is this amazing building which is still here when so many symbols of London's radical history are being erased. And it's here in Clerkenwell Green, an area that for decades, even going back to previous century, has had strong associations with the radical movement. And this library was set up in 1933, but it's got more of a story to it. Alex, do you want to tell us something about the library?
We've had here, meeting in this wonderful building, at various times, Karl Marx and the General Council of the International Working Men's Association, who used the coffee shop on the right hand side of this building for their monthly meetings. It was here that Marx came along and gave his famous talk, Wages, Price and Profit, or Value, Price and Profit, as he called it. It was here that the London Patriotic Society, a rather sort of perhaps odd sounding organisation to our ears, but the London Patriotic Society was the first working class political organisation in which women could be full members, and it argued for full universal suffrage. It was founded here, it met here.
Yeah, and I know that Eleanor Marx was one of the speakers they had, as well as William Morris, Peter Kropotkin, the anarchists. Yeah. So there was a kind of history of radicalism long before it became the Marx Memorial Library.
Morris moved his printing press in here in the 1870s. It became really the place where most left-wing newspapers, socialist newspapers, were produced and published in Britain. And Lenin, of course, used this as his office when he lived in London in 1902 to 1903, and he edited Iskra, the Bolsheviks newspaper, here as well. And the reason we have the library today is because in 1933, what happens in Germany, Hitler comes to power, and in January there are mass book burnings in Berlin. The response of the left and trade unionists here in London was to call a meeting in Conway Hall, just down the road from here, and they argued that what was necessary was to defend the ideas of Marx that were being burnt in the streets of Berlin, and that the best way to do this would be to found a library which would hold his books and books about him, where people could come and find out about the science of Marxism. So that's why we're here, and that's what we try to do.
When I was researching Rebel Footprints, I spent a lot of time in a number of archives, both in London and outside of London. And one of the archives that I came to was the Marx Memorial Library, which was very useful, particularly in terms of looking at the press, like the Daily Worker, at the time of the Battle of Cable Street, and in the kind of lead up to it and in the aftermath. And also a lot of the books that are on the shelves in this library gave me lots of really, really kind of useful background information. But as well as having all these books, there's something about the whole scenery of this room. And you've got this amazing mural behind us. And Alex, tell us a bit about this mural.
It's an interesting, it's a unique piece of art.
Yeah.
And we love it. And it's part of the great art tradition that we've got in the library as well. because although obviously the text and the word is what we're in the business of keeping, it's also about communicating with people through pictures, and particularly I think in the early working class political traditions where literacy was a real problem. Posters, murals, and even some of our photographs and the light lanterns that were used to project images at early political meetings. We've got all of those in our collection here.
Yeah, and I think, and it's interesting because today we've got this mural indoors like this, but there's very few remaining outdoor murals telling the stories of the struggles that went on in the 19th century and in the early parts of the 20th century. You have got the Cable Street mural in East London. You've also got a mural in Islington alongside a pub, which is near where a march started in 1834 in support of the Tolpuddle martyrs. And alongside that pub in Copenhagen Street, you've got that mural. But there's so few memorials to those great struggles. Here we are outside what was the Middlesex Sessions House, and in 1832 there were three people called William Lovett, William Benbow and James Watson, and they were on trial for political activities. Because in 1832, one of the stories I tell in the book is that there was a big crisis in London, and that crisis was a terrible outbreak of cholera. And the government decided that the reason why there was this terrible outbreak of cholera was because it was the judgment of God. Now, not everyone believed that, and there was an organisation which had come into being shortly before then called the National Union of the Working Classes. The government felt the best way to deal with it was to have a day of fasting. The National Union of the Working Class wrote in their paper that the workers have enough days of fasting every day in the week, and what they need is a feast day, not a fast day. And so they called upon their members to gather in Finsbury Square to get fresh air that day, to march around London and come back to a feast in the East End. And 40,000 supporters of the National Union of the Working Class gathered that day, and they'd mapped out a route that took them into the areas where they wouldn't normally go, a lot of the richer areas of town, but they had to deal with the police. Now, the Metropolitan Police had only been set up in 1829. They weren't very used to handling demonstrations, though they were soon going to get a bit more practice than they maybe intended. And on that day, as the marchers got to the area near Temple, they were met by large ranks of police with staves and cutlasses, and then there was a kind of cat and mouse game going on through London as they had to break away from their route, and they sent small groups ahead to tell them that that it was clear there weren't sort of groups of police there that would stop them. And they ended up being around Tottenham Court Road, and at Tottenham Court Road there was a large phalanx of police that hadn't been spotted. They were hiding behind the main road, and then they suddenly burst into the demonstration, separated the leaders, the front of it, from the followers, and at that point it had been an entirely peaceful demonstration, but at that moment people picked up whatever they could and started pelting the police with whatever was in their hands, and it all ended up very chaotically, and in the days that followed, these three individuals, Benbow, Lovett and Watson, were all arrested, and they were held they were held on remand, and some weeks later their trial came up here in the Sessions House, and they didn't employ anyone to defend them. They defended themselves, and they called various witnesses who had heard the police discussing the tactics that they were going to use, and so particularly around Tottenham Court Road. And at the end of the trial, the judge concluded that actually that that the blame for the situation that occurred that day was with the police rather than with the demonstrators, and they were acquitted. And there was huge cheering both inside the court and outside the court, where they had lots of supporters gathered. Many of the social struggles that took place in London that I talk about in the book took place in inner London. And as I was writing it, I was thinking it'd be great to have a plaque put up here or a plaque put up there to commemorate particular people, particular struggles. But it's harder and harder to think about where you would mount such plaques, because London is undergoing a very rapid change at the moment, and a lot of those inner city areas are now being recolonised by massive wealth. Buildings where momentous decisions happened, where important protests happened, are being swept away. New office blocks, new financial offices are sort of going up in their place, luxury flats. And we can't put the bricks back, and we can't sort of rebuild those places where those meetings happened, where those events took place. But what we can do is restore the people to our collective memory. And that's, in a way, one of the main purposes of the book, is to tell ordinary people's stories. It's the story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and all of them inspired by the idea that of change, but also the idea that we don't change things by ourselves, we change things collectively. The people that were part of movements in London that changed London came from a variety of backgrounds. They spoke many different languages, but what they shared was a common language of protest. And people worked between 14 to 18 hours a day in the sweatshops. What would you do if you were in that situation, if you were working such long hours, being paid so little? Would you just take it? Form a union. Okay, so let's form a union here among all of us, yeah? So we've formed a union. Look, I think we've got quite a strong union. Are you all in?
Yes.
Yep, everyone's in the union. What do we do then?
Fight for our rights.
We fight for our rights and we go on strike. Yeah? In 1889, about 7,000 to 8,000 immigrant Jewish tailors from Eastern Europe went on strike. What they were striking for was the 12-hour day. They wanted to work for only 12 hours and have tea breaks as well, yeah? And not work for 14 hours or 18 hours. They also didn't want work given to them as they were leaving the factory on the way home to say, can you finish this overnight? That also used to happen to them. Now, their union, when they were on strike, their union paid them some money from the strike fund to sustain the families while they were on strike. But 4 weeks into the strike, the money in the strike fund has gone really low. There's almost nothing in it. They can't keep the strike going. And the employers are standing firm. They don't want to give in for this 12-hour day. And so at that point it looks like the tailors are going to have to go back to work having won nothing. But there's one last thing they try to do to replenish the strike fund. Because in 1889 there was another very big strike in the East End. It was the dockers. You've got the River Thames here and the docks, and the dockers made a huge amount of the workforce of the East End. It was very casualised, the work, but there was a lot of thousands and thousands of people involved in dock work and in dock related work. And the dockers were also, a lot of them were immigrants. They were Irish immigrants, Irish Catholics. The Irish Catholics and the East European Jews weren't always the best of friends. Tailors went to the dock strike committee and put their case to them. And they came back with a promise of a donation, which came through a couple of days later. And it was the biggest single donation they got from anyone. It was, because I've got here the accounts of the strike, and there's one donation which is in 3 figures, £100, and that's from the Dock Strike Committee. And with that money from the Irish Catholic dockers, the union, the tailors, knew they could keep the strike going. And then the employers were really worried because they could see the whole season clothing trade going. Within 2 weeks they settled. They gave in to all those demands that the strikers had made. And they would not have won that strike without the solidarity of the Irish dockers. The book is a celebration of collective struggles that have changed London and changed people's lives right in their own lifetimes. You know, they wanted a brighter future for their children, but they also wanted to change things in the here and now. Some of those struggles ended in defeats, but a lot of them were victories. And a lot of the victories we see all around us today. The things that were created out of those struggles. We've got a health service today, a national health service. We've got free universal education. We've got adults, all adults, whatever their background, with the right to vote. These were not handed down to people. These were struggled for from the grassroots up by the kind of people that I've talked about in the book. Those kind of struggles that took place, it's very easy for that to be erased. And the point of this book is to help sort of stop them being erased and to make those struggles live in the present, where they can inspire the kind of people that are protesting today about the issues that they are concerned about.